This hour sponsored by Addo, the power behind the storage.
This is NAB Show Live.
Hello and welcome to NAB Show Live, powered by Broadcast Beat. So for this session, we're going to be talking all about sports. So I've got three guests with me. So I've got Jay from Supponor, Andy from BT Sport, and Ken from Sports Video. So I think the first question really is, what are you seeing that's new for sports in 2019, and especially for the big year of 2020? Who's first?
Well, you know, we've been obviously at SVG, we go track out all the events and do a lot of traveling around, seeing what people are doing from a production standpoint. You know, I think that for me, the biggest thing I've seen this year, which was interesting, was CBS of the Super Bowl used 8K, deployed 8K within a super zoom, I guess, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Super zoom extraction mode. They didn't get to use it in the game because the game was so terrible. But what was interesting was the week before, in the championship game, there was a play where they actually could have used that. They had a 4K camera, but when they zoomed in, I think their resolution was around 700 lines, so it was definitely not HD.
Yeah.
So I think they proved the case for why you need 8K, so I'm curious to see how 8K will have a role within sports productions. But I mean, look, the shows are getting bigger, as you know. They're getting more robust. The OTT stuff, platforms are getting more content and original content.
Yeah.
So those are some of the big trends, but more is better with sports.
Yeah. Jay, what are you seeing?
Well, I think one of the things we want to talk about also is, where we're seeing a lot of move towards, remote production and more centralization of management of the overall infrastructure. And I think, the FIBA World Cup that's going to be in China this summer is an interesting example of that, where you're having a lot more vertical integration because you have a sort of top-down control, by the federation itself, and also with a very, sort of difficult environment from an infrastructure standpoint. I mean, China's a very modern country, but it has its own challenges in terms of getting signals here and there with some clarity and certainty. So I think that's one of the things that'll be very interesting to see how that goes.
Yeah. Andy?
I think it's, some of the stuff's been mentioned. We're going to see things like HDR really become mature.
Yeah.
HDR Live, there's been lots of HDR posts for a long time and it's great, but HDR Live is much more complicated as we've seen. But I think we'll start to see it reach maturity this year and into next year with the Olympics and things.
Yeah.
We've already announced that at some point in the next year we will launch an HDR proposition, so we're working hard on that.
Right.
I think cloud has been bubbling away for a while, and I think we'll get to the point probably in the next 18 months where some form of proper cloud-based production is now possible. And there are proof of concept products from a number of vendors here sort of showing it. They're still a little bit early, missing some of the features that are needed, but I think we'll start to see that ramp up as they increase the tool sets to become really valuable rather than just a bit of an interesting idea.
Yeah.
So when you've been wandering on the show floor, I know that HDR has been very complicated and complex the last couple of years. Are you feeling that are the live solutions becoming more holistic and easier on the floor, or is it still a little complicated as far as the formats, the flavors?
It's still complicated. I think the ecosystem we've designed as an industry is not great. We've come up with a variety of different formats, and truthfully it's going to be difficult to interop actually, because different people in different sports organizations, different territories are going to do different things, which is going to be a headache for the likes of OBS and the Olympics and so on and so forth. And truthfully, generating really good HDR with really good SDR with a single production workflow is really hard, but we have to do that to make it commercially viable, and we will do it. And we've been working really, really hard. Did a big broadcast the other day, FA Cup quarter-final game at Watford, where we did exactly that, HDR-centric production with all the things we have to have, 22 cameras, VAR integration, PRO analysis, HDR replays, graphic, the works. So it's doable, but it is still technically very complicated and needs a lot of expertise to make sure it doesn't go wrong. And that's the problem. The danger is that you can make it, if you're not careful, things can go wrong.
Right.
But I think that will come easier. There's more product coming. I think we'll start to share some knowledge. That'll help as well. But I think the interop's probably the challenge with different people having different philosophies, because I see now different people doing very different things in different territories, which makes it very hard to content share.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Jay, you spoke about remote production. I mean, what are you seeing as the benefits of that?
Well, I think it's most people are looking at it from a sort of economic standpoint, but I think the real drivers here are about quality control and consistency.
Yeah.
The overall complexity of on-site productions. As I came into this industry 3 years ago, I'm continually shocked at the amount of inefficiencies and what I'll call wastage in a very expensive environment.
Yeah.
And the concerns over the risks of anything going wrong, which of course is a major impediment to migrating in the cloud and things like that. But ultimately, you can start to have a better controlled environment. You can have operators that are more experienced because they can do 3 or 4 games in a week instead of 1 or 2. You might end up with people with lower divorce rates because they're not traveling all the time. There might be an period, by the way, with higher divorce rates. Where people come home and find out a few things they didn't mean to.
Wait, there are a lot of people who I have heard divorce rates will go up if they have to be home. I honestly heard that from people.
To jump in, I think for us, we've done a lot of work on remote. And there's a lot of people who are more advanced than us, but we think there's like 3 tiers of remote, depending on the type of content we're making and the type of sport or the league. And so we've kind of developed 3 tiers. One is kind of entry level, based around cellular bonded technology, 4 or 5 camera events.
Right.
But you kind of cap out in the 4G world at about 4 or 5 cameras and run out of bandwidth. But it's great for smaller events where you haven't got to have loads of cameras. Then we have this middle tier football kind of model, which we're using 4K satellite technology for actually. So we put up a pair of satellite paths in 4K.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We use the quadrants to bring back 4 separate 1080p 50 signals. We put camera 1 on both in case we lose one. And then we also complement that with from a mobile viewpoint or some cellular bonded things on cameras that don't need to be synchronous. So for example, net cams in the goals don't need to be synchronous, they're a replay only. So we can get about 9 or 10 cameras. And that's actually a really comprehensive production, and then we can move on to the full kind of fiber integrated high-end, which starts to unlock 4K and other things if we want to do that. But for us, just to go back to the point about benefits, I think we see 5 things. Actually, when you start to untether, if you use the mobile model of 4G or satellite with RF, you can start to really rethink some of the editorial, so you can unlock things that never happened before. So for example, when we did a 4G game on National League, which is a lower tier event in the UK, you could do things like send a cellular bonded camera, off to meet the team bus of the visiting team, jump on the bus at a service station and ride in live. You would never do that in a traditional AB. You wouldn't have those kind of shots. You get them arriving off the bus, but that's it.
Right.
So you can chat with the coach on the journey, and so it gives you a completely different insight. And if you rethink how that all works, you can, to put out traditional RF coverage requires a massive array of antennas around a stadium. But we did a one shot from the coach walking down off the coach through to the front door, down the dressing rooms, out into the pitch, through the tunnel. And you just couldn't do that traditionally, all for very low cost.
And your teams, are they able to think about that? Are they creative so that they're...
Yeah, when they start to see it, it's really interesting. So we started off kind of trying to do what we already do, and then they realised that actually this is quite interesting. We can unlock some really interesting ideas, and that's why we had these kind of. And I'm sure there'll be more. We've had those ideas, but once production really get into it, they're the creative guys. They'll think of some more.
That's a good point, because if all you do is take the current fairly rigid system and say, oh, fine, we're gonna move it all centralized, you miss the benefit of people being able to innovate,
right, exactly,
and try different things, right, and because they can now, right, in a more flexible manner. So it shouldn't be just cost savings. It should be other things as well, because things we can't do before.
We actually think, in our list of 5 things that are interesting about remote production, cost savings is the last one, right? Yeah. If you're trying to do it to save money, you're not actually doing it for the right reason. There is some commercial advantage if you get it right, but that's really about cost transformation, not cost-saving initiative to allow us to think about how we reuse that money for other things, maybe bring in some more rights, give us more hours. For us, it's more about, it's about the editorial rethinking. It's about work-life balance for staff, which I know we just talked about, but actually, I can give you examples of staff who, to go on a Sunday 12:30 game in London, in the UK, in the Women's Super League, would have to go on a Saturday. That's an overnight stay from home. It's 2 days of their time away. We lose them for 2 days out of their working roster, where they can come in at lunchtime, do the game, be home for tea with the children. Yeah. So, and then the other thing is about accessibility. OB trucks are not accessible places, right? So it doesn't really allow for great inclusion. Yeah. But actually, studios are all designed, for full width, wheelchair access, etc., etc. So actually, it's a much more inclusive workplace when you work remote in a facility.
Absolutely.
Than an OB truck.
Yeah.
So there are other really interesting benefits.
And Andy, I know you've spoken about 5G a lot before. So what's going to happen?
Well, we think 5G is really exciting. So I mentioned a minute ago about the cap, and we think in a typical stadium in the UK, 4 or 5 cameras kind of maxes out.
Yeah.
It depends on the venue, obviously, and the number of people and everything else. But The good thing about 5G is it has a really important two new characteristics: low latency, and actually it's not really about high bandwidth, it's about manageable bandwidth. So there's a technology piece in the stack of 5G which is called slicing, where we can actually carve off dedicated bandwidth. At the minute with 4G, it's just best endeavors, everyone's sharing the same pool. And so if everyone turns up and starts streaming or using Twitter or whatever, everyone's consuming. With slicing, we can guarantee some space, and you can order it, by data rate, bandwidth size, the time you want it. It can be down to minutes. So it's much more accessible, and it's dedicated bandwidth just for this one use case.
Yeah.
And so that will make a huge difference to guaranteeing the uptime. It's a quality of service issue, basically.
I think you're going to have to be really cautious with 5G. The hype that was around 3G when it came out, then 4G, has generally never been realized, both in terms of coverage. So if you're trying to use the public network, now if you're using private 5G, with a stadium environment, that's quite good for transport and things like that. And it doesn't actually have very high bandwidth, but depending on which of the flavor you're using, whether the high sort of super millimeter or lower 600 hertz, it doesn't have very good penetration capability. So the high millimeter one won't go through a piece of paper. So it has to be very line of sight.
Yeah.
And someone's going to have to convince me on what happens in severe weather conditions with rain and sleet, for example. There's been lots of examples in other kinds of wireless technologies where that could be a bit concerning. So I think you're going to have to be very cautious on how you use it, get some real experience with it. It's taking you into a sector of telecommunications probably that there's a lot less experience with. And I think it could open up a lot of creativity. Jumping on the hype bandwagon too early can be maybe someone lives to regret, perhaps. So.
I think, I think it gets muddled very quickly on the 5G conversation, because, for example, at the NBA All-Star game, the head of AT&T was talking about how, we're going to deploy 5G, and within 3 years, you're not going to have wired broadband, which is ridiculous because it's going to be so expensive to deploy enough 5G to do that. But what you're talking about is not necessarily riding on those networks, right?
No, right.
What you guys have done and what Fox Sports did at the US Open, do you envision the same sort of thing? You bring in a dedicated node, and then you're in charge of your own node, and you can split up cameras, or do you?
No, I think it'll be. I think it's different. What we're looking at, and we're lucky to have EE as part of our family of within BT Group, and
True.
So what we're looking at is where can we strategically align cellular siting to give and put more backhaul on those sites where we won't want to do remote production over 5G, and then we can enable the slicing, to exactly your point, to make sure we've got enough bandwidth available, but in the right places. If we just ride on the back of a consumer network, it's not going to work. But if we're going to put a consumer network in, we can also isolate which cells need more backhaul and put it in at the same time.
Yeah, the line of sight backhaul is very powerful, and fairly easy to set up from that. And will be an automatically licensed spectrum, which will make it easier too for sort of private networks.
I guess the other thing that maybe you can share some insights, but what is the throughput for these nodes?
It's not. We were doing in the trial. We did at Wembley back in the summer. We were getting about 125 megabit, but the problem we had was actually tension of the whole cellular space in that area, because there's so much 4G. There wasn't much bandwidth left to add the 5G node on, because you have to piggyback on the 4G cell to then uplink to the 5G. So, it's a complicated ecosystem. I mean, they're forecasting very big numbers. I'm not sure yet what the real numbers are going to be. But.
Yeah, because I think Fox was pushed, because they were obviously dedicated. It was their own. So they were pushing through, I want to say, 650?
Yeah, well, the demo the Huawei ran was showing 500 plus, but that was not in a congested cell area. Right. So this is why we have to be a little bit careful. But I still think.
And how much? I'm curious. How much of this is driven? A lot of the adoption of 4K is about marketing differentiation potentially for your viewers. Whether or not they actually are watching it in 4K, if it's filmed in 4K, can be a differentiator. Is 5G one of those? Is that something exciting for people, or is it just vendors trying to get the broadcasters excited about something?
Well, I'll speak for Fox. I think when you talk to Brad Cheney at Fox, his vision is the ability to roll into a stadium and not have to cable any cameras, and just be able to kind of just go. You get your node, you divide it up, you dedicate your bandwidth, right? So you're guaranteed. You're free of all the issues of 4G LTE, where you roll in the stadium, the fans come in and they fire up, and you're like, got nothing left. So that's what his vision is. And for golf courses especially also.
But it's not a consumer proposition in the same way of 4K.
No, I understand.
An enabler for,
and that's why it gets all muddled, because people.
But I would argue that the biggest enabler for that is finally agreeing a standard for video over IP 2110, because that's been the biggest thing that's a roadblock for people who've been able to develop equipment. And if you start to take IP and think of what you can do in other networks, we were talking about earlier, being able to effectively plug into a network, wired or wireless either, and having things automatically recognized and be able to be controlled. If you pre-wire a stadium and have enough plug-in points, I'm not sure how much it matters, but to be honest, so. But 5G has other great benefits because this allows you to go sort of, multicast within a stadium. So if you have a lot of people on individual devices that you want to be able to transmit to, there's a lot of cool things that are really going to come out of that.
Experience in the stadium. Sure.
And what about VR? Talking of new technologies.
So if you mean VR 360 or virtual reality and something, we do a lot of both. So we have a unique VR 360 player within inside our normal 2D app. We do a lot of Premier League and Champions League coverage. We're going to do the Champions League final again this year in Madrid. 9-camera live created feed, got, graphics, replays, commentary, all in 360. We still think there's a place for it. The quality is improving all the time. Tile-based encoding techniques are now maturing. One of the problems we have with 360 was you had to have 4K read to get the resolution. You need a lot of bandwidth, and it's actually really inefficient to a point because you're only seeing on time a small area of the whole 360 sphere in 4K. If we can then use tile media encoding to specify, to prioritize the bits you want to actually send, a bit like Google Maps, then it's a much more efficient way and increases the quality threshold enormously, which we think is very exciting.
So do you have any insights into how the consumers are? Do you know whether they're wearing the goggles or they're just doing the steering thing?
Mainly it's no goggles because they want to flip it out. So it's all about interactivity. So they're not just doing VR; they're looking at all the replays and the multicam timeline. They're going back and looking at the stats and the gameplay. And so the problem with putting your phone into your goggles, as great an experience as that is it alienates you from the rest of the experiences that are going on. So now it's available to us. We put these 360 clips on the replay line, on the timeline at the bottom, so you can watch a multicam replay from a TV angle or a VR, or you can watch the live stream, or you can put it in the headset if you want to. Right.
Well, plus also people don't want to put their phones in it because they want to be.
They want to text and Twitter.
Exactly.
So they want to be online.
So do you think that do you think the goggles thing is ever going to be a thing? Like this whole concept of sitting for 3 hours?
No.
With it? No.
I think there'll be niche cases. We saw it's interesting. You get a big event, it will drive. Particular people will drive a use, and it will never be a massive use, but there are people, if it's a typical gamer, for example, the gaming community, we know is much more engaged with goggles, so if you're a PlayStation 4 Pro user with VR, you're much more likely to use that experience than if you're just a normal consumer. So it's not going to be mass market, but I think on a big event basis where it's really interesting content, high value content, exciting content, it will drive some usage, but on the whole, it's all about the magic window.
You really have to be on the watch out for things that are just kind of cool and trendy and hype. Goggles I think is a prime example of it may be quite effective, but they're a stepping stone because you learn from that experience. But I think one of the challenges if you start developing for that environment is you're cutting off the social aspect. If you're watching something together, you're experiencing together, or if you're actually in the stadium, in some ways, well, you might as well just be at home in some way. So, Google Glasses, which was not overly successful, but as a first step, tells you that if you had something that allows you to, see the game, see something and get some augmented information or things, that kind of thing starts to be very interesting. And whether or not that sticks, you're not taking away from the game, you're adding to it, or others kind of take you out of the game in some way. So personally, probably because I'm old, I struggle with that, and I think too many people have vertigo issues as well, with goggles and things like that. It's very hard to watch for any length of time.
Well, here at the CS show, there were some really, really compelling Google Glass type devices where sorry, I didn't mean to use air quotes, but some Google Glass devices where when you put them on, it was there'd be a whale kind of leaping out of the water and swimming in front of you like in a virtual 3D space. And it was really, it was, so you're able to see through the glasses, and then within the glasses, this was layered over the top of it. I think, and it was a much more compelling experience than what Google Glass was. So
and that's much more augmented reality, where you're mixing virtual and real. And to make that interesting and compelling, in my view, to really be augmented reality, it has to interact in some way with the environment, not just be some overlay that's floating out in space. But the whale's over there where there's a stream, and as soon as you look over this direction, there's something land-based.
I think some really interesting things around analysis, bringing player analysis into the home for you to be involved. Not with the glasses, but Fox in Australia did a really interesting augmented reality thing around the Bathurst race 2 years ago, where they had an app on the coasters and the bars with a QR code, and if you clicked on it and you were in the bar watching the Bathurst 1000, it brought up an AR race map, and you could look around the thing and see the rim behind you, the pub, but you could then see all the cars, and So I think there's some interesting ideas there about bringing player analysis and things into the room with you, whether it's through glasses or otherwise.
Yeah.
So that's
It's definitely about augmented.
the next big thing. So we have to wrap up. So that was a great conversation between the three of you.
That's it.
That's it.
Just getting started.
Just warming up.
Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah. So thank you very much for coming on
Thanks,
NAB
Sadie.
Show Live, and have a great show.
Thanks,
Thank
you
you.
too.
Thank you.